All right, today we are jumping into one of the most intense and symbolic scenes in the entire book of Revelation, what's called the Supper of the Great God. It's a vision of a final decisive battle, but what's so fascinating is how it starts. It doesn't begin with a clash of armies, but with an invitation to the cleanup. Let's see what that's all about. So right out of the gate, we get this shocking call. An angel, standing in the sun of all places, is shouting an invitation. But he's not calling kings or soldiers. He's calling every bird that flies. He's telling them to gather for a huge feast prepared by God. And, well, the main course is pretty grim.
Okay, so what's the deal with this angel's announcement? Why start here? Well, it's not just for dramatic effect. The source material we're looking at says this makes a really profound point about how this whole conflict is going to end, even before it really begins.
And this is the key. Think about it. The outcome of this war is so absolutely certain, God is sending out the dinner invitations to the cleanup crew before the first sword is even swung. It tells you right away that for God's enemies, this is not a battle, it's a foregone conclusion.
So, if the birds are the guests, what exactly is on the menu at the supper of the great God? The prophecy is incredibly specific and honestly, pretty graphic about who and what is being served.
Yeah, there's really no sugarcoating that, is there? The text lays out this whole hierarchy of power. You've got kings, high-ranking military captains, powerful warriors, their entire cavalry, the whole military machine. And they're all destined to become bird food.
What this list really drives home is just how complete this judgment is. It's the ultimate equalizer, isn't it? It doesn't matter if you're a king on a throne or a servant. If you're standing on the wrong side of this fight, you're on the menu. No one gets a pass. Now, here's a really interesting connection. This whole idea of a feast for birds isn't coming out of nowhere. John, who's writing Revelation, is pulling this image directly from a much older prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. And notice the language there. It's not just a battle, it's a sacrifice. This links the final judgment in Revelation to a long, long history of prophetic warnings.
So this all leads to the obvious question, right? Who are these armies? Who is it that has gathered all their power to fight against Christ, the rider on the white horse and his army from heaven?
The text gives us two main villains here, personifying the entire opposition, the beast and the false prophet. Now, according to the specific interpretation we're exploring, these aren't just some abstract forces of evil. They're meant to represent very real, very powerful political and historical groups from the time this was all written.
First up, the beast. In this view, that's code for the Roman Empire. I mean, think about it. Rome was the undisputed superpower of the day. It was the political and military giant that was actively persecuting the first Christians. So the beast represents that massive worldly power standing against God.
And then you have the false prophet. This interpretation identifies this figure with the religious establishment in Jerusalem, the very leadership that had rejected Jesus. So the idea here is that this represents religious authority that has become corrupt, that's actually leading people away from the truth and into opposition with God.
Okay, so we've identified the enemies as this unholy team-up of corrupt political power and corrupt religious power. The vision, then, turns to their specific fate, and for the leaders, judgment is incredibly swift and decisive.
And this is a really crucial detail. The beast and the false prophet, the symbolic ringleaders of this whole rebellion, are captured. They don't just get killed on the battlefield with everyone else. No, they are taken alive and thrown into something else entirely.
So what is this lake of fire? Our source material is pretty direct. It defines it as hell. It's a place of spiritual punishment, but it's not even their final end. It's more like a holding cell where these spiritual forces are contained until a later final judgment that happens way down the line in the story of Revelation.
But what about the human armies they led astray? You know, the remnant whose flesh was promised to the birds. Well, according to the interpretation we're following, their defeat looks very different. It's not an instantaneous event, but something that plays out over the long, slow grind of history.
See, the text says they were slain by the sword that came out of the mouth of Christ on the horse. This isn't a literal steel blade, it's symbolic. The sword is the word of God. It's divine truth, it's judgment, and it's that truth that spiritually condemns and defeats those who stand against it.
Now here's where this interpretation gets very specific with history. It identifies this remnant as the Jewish people who were carried off into slavery after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD.
And it suggests their judgment wasn't a single event, but a historical process that affected their descendants for generations.
And this timeline just lays it all out. It frames nearly 2,000 years of history, from the scattering by Rome, centuries of persecution, even through the absolute horror of the Holocaust, as the long, drawn-out fulfillment of this single prophecy. But it doesn't end in tragedy. In this view, the re-establishment of Israel after World War II marks a turning point, opening up a new path forward.
So, let's just recap. The armies that opposed God are defeated. Their symbolic leaders, the beast and the false prophet, have been captured and thrown into the lake of fire. And the long judgment of their followers has been set in motion. The entire spiritual and political chessboard has been wiped clean.
And this whole dramatic scene brings us right to a huge hanging question. The main antagonists we've been watching, the beast and the false prophet, they've been dealt with. But what about the ultimate source of all the rebellion, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes? What happens to Satan? He's still out there. And that question is the perfect setup for everything that's about to happen next.